Hey there, viewers. Ever had one of those moments where you forgot someone was watching and let something slip you shouldn't have? Share your stories in the comments. I know it's happened to all of us. Today, Diddy made that exact mistake. He didn't realize the camera was still rolling, and what he did next will leave you stunned. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Static in the feed. I wasn't supposed to still be there when it happened. My shift had ended 30 minutes ago, maybe 40, but I hung around like I usually did, making myself invisible in the corners. Most of the time, nobody noticed me. That was the way I liked it, kept things simple. I worked the security systems, the server logs, the feeds that ran all around the house. Nothing fancy, no real authority, just maintenance, eyes on screens, checking that cameras stayed running and nothing crashed. That night wasn't different. Or at least, it didn't seem different at first. Everyone had already logged off. There'd been some big virtual meeting, half a dozen people on the call, a couple lawyers, Diddy himself sitting in his private studio chair, lit up by the soft blue glow from the monitor. I could hear bits of it when I passed by earlier, legal talk mostly, serious voices, deadlines, filings, phrases like mitigation strategy and public exposure. Nothing I needed to get into, not my lane. They all signed off eventually. One by one, the screens blinked dark, except for his. Diddy stayed sitting there, shoulders stiff, glass half full beside him, the leather chair creaking whenever he shifted. I watched the feed like I always did. Habit, really. The red light on the studio camera was still on. Blinking faint, steady, recording. I could have shut it off. I had access, but no one told me to, and it wasn't protocol to interfere unless there was a direct request. So I sat there behind the security desk, screens glowing in front of me, watching him without really thinking about it. He didn't move for a long while, just sat, staring at nothing, jaw tight. Then he reached for his phone, the one he always kept turned screen side down, and dialed a number. His voice was low, hard to catch unless you were leaning in. Which I was. "Yeah, it's me." Long pause. "No, they're gone, you can talk." His tone had an edge to it, sharp like broken glass under bare feet. I heard pieces' names mentioned. The way you mention people you don't trust anymore. Grudges, under the surface. He talked about pressure, lawsuits breathing down his neck, something about how everyone jumps ship when things get rough. He kept talking, words tight, clipped, like he was holding something back, and then he said it. "I've still got the insurance, all of it, tucked away. They think I forget." I sat up straighter, not because I understood exactly what he meant, but because of the way he said it, like he wasn't bluffing. Like he was reminding himself more than whoever was on the other end of the line. It wasn't my business. None of this ever was. I was background noise to these people, someone to keep the machines running, fix glitches, log updates. I wasn't supposed to care what got said once everyone thought the cameras were off. But something about the way he sat there, his fingers tapping slow against the glass on the table, made me pay attention. The call ended. He didn't hang up right away. He kept the phone in his hand like it might say more, even though the line had gone quiet. And then he leaned forward, pulling open one of the drawers at his side. From where the camera was angled, I could see his fingers close around something. Old, worn edges, the kind of thing you don't show off but keep close. A folder, thick with papers. He set it on the table like it weighed more than it should. He didn't open it right away, just stared at it for a minute, rubbing his thumb over some kind of mark on the front. A symbol maybe, or just a scuff. Couldn't see clearly. Then, slow, deliberate, he undid the clasp and started flipping through. The camera caught it all, every page he touched, every shift in his eyes, and I knew the feed was still syncing, backing up to the encrypted server like always. Hours of footage. Nothing unusual about that, except this time, nobody remembered the light was still blinking. I glanced down at my system logs out of habit. That's when I noticed it. Storage spike, higher than it should have been. The auto protocol was flagging unusual activity, not an error exactly, but an anomaly. I should have checked it properly right then, isolated the file, maybe alerted someone. But I didn't. My phone buzzed on the desk, a message from my brother about something stupid. Dinner plans, I think. I clicked past the log alert and figured I'd get to it later. On screen, Diddy kept flipping through the folder. Occasionally he paused, holding something longer, a photo here, a handwritten note there. Couldn't make out the details from the distance, but the way he stared down at them told me they mattered. He muttered under his breath once, something about loyalty, about debts. I leaned closer without meaning to. The room around him stayed quiet. No one else there. No assistants, no guards, no distractions. Just him and the folder and that blinking red light no one seemed to notice. I probably watched longer than I should have. It felt like standing too close to a lit fuse. You know you shouldn't, but you can't help it. Eventually he slid the folder shut again, hands lingering like he wasn't ready to put it away. He leaned back in the chair, eyes unfocused, and for a long moment he just sat there, breathing slow, heavy. Almost looked away, almost turned back to my logs to clear the alert and call it a night. But then something shifted on the screen. Not him, someone else. A figure passing behind him, barely caught on the edge of the frame. Could have been anyone, staff, maybe, but they didn't make a sound. Just a shadow moving quick, like they knew where the cameras were and how to avoid them. I blinked, unsure if I actually saw it, leaned forward, squinting, but the studio door never opened, no sound. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe not. My radio crackled, someone upstairs asking if anyone was still on shift. I answered automatically, voice low, eyes still glued to the feed. Diddy finally stood, stretching, like the weight of everything he'd just flipped through was settling on his shoulders. He reached out, clicked off the desk lamp. Only he forgot the camera. The red light blinked, steady as ever. I watched as he left the studio, the folder tucked back under his arm. The room empty now, but the feed still running, recording everything, syncing to the server. And I don't know why, but instead of shutting it down like I should have, I left it. Maybe curiosity, maybe something else. My shift was long over, no reason to stay. But I sat there another 5 minutes, staring at the screen, wondering about that folder, wondering who else might have noticed, and wondering why I had the sinking feeling someone already had. Chapter 2. The Folder and the Unspoken Names. I didn't sleep that night. I don't know why exactly. Maybe it was just habit, being wired after a long shift staring at screens too long, but there was something different crawling under my skin. I kept thinking about that damn blinking light, about how the feed kept recording after everyone else signed off, and how I didn't shut it down when I noticed. It wasn't like me to let things slide, but something about the whole thing felt off, like a door had been left cracked open and I wasn't sure who was on the other side. I told myself I'd deal with it in the morning, that I'd wipe the extra footage from the server before anyone higher up saw the storage anomaly. Easy fix, nobody would ever need to know. But by the time the sun came up, something else had already started moving. When I checked back in, pulling up the logs out of routine, I noticed something strange. A few download requests buried in the data. Not flagged exactly, nothing outright suspicious, but they weren't from any of the usual accounts. Internal, sure, but one of them didn't belong to anyone on my clearance list. Someone had accessed the footage sometime between me leaving and coming back, quietly. No trace left, unless you knew how to look. I stared at the logs longer than I should have. The footage itself was still sitting there, intact, but there was no telling how much of it had already been copied, passed along. My stomach twisted. I thought about that folder Diddy had pulled out, the one he kept thumbing through like it held more weight than anything said during the meeting. I couldn't get it out of my head. The way his eyes lingered on those papers, the half-muttered names, the tension crawling across his face every time he flipped a page. It wasn't just personal notes. It wasn't nostalgia. There was something calculated in it, like each piece of paper was a chess move kept in reserve, something to be pulled when needed. And apparently someone else knew it too. By the afternoon, I started hearing the whispers, not through official channels but the back routes, the way people talk when they're pretending not to, a phone call cut short when you walk by, side glances exchanged between staff who normally keep their mouths shut. It hadn't hit public yet, nothing messy like that, but word was getting around. Quietly. Names being spoken behind doors, people asking who had seen what. I tried not to get caught up in it, tried to keep my head down, focus on my job, but the more I thought about it, the more something gnawed at me. Whoever downloaded the footage wasn't some random outsider. It was someone inside. Someone close enough to know the cameras were rolling, but careful enough to keep it quiet. And they hadn't gone public. No tabloids, no media circus. That wasn't the goal. They were passing it along hand to the kinds of people who knew exactly what to do with something like that. I started wondering what was really on that footage. The parts I watched, yeah, I caught bits and pieces, Diddy's frustration, talk of betrayals, that folder. But I hadn't seen every second, hadn't sat through the hours of him poring over whatever was in those pages. Curiosity gets dangerous when you let it linger too long. I found myself replaying sections late at night, the studio feed looping over and over, grainy in some spots, clearer in others, watching him lean back in that chair, flick through old photos, yellowed papers. At first glance, some of it looked harmless. Black and white shots from years ago, parties, meetings, faces I half recognized. But it wasn't about what was in the pictures. It was about when they were taken, dates scribbled on the back, locations, people who shouldn't have been in the same room. Every now and then, he'd pause, holding a photo longer, or a sheet of paper with writing that looked like it had been redrafted too many times. Little details jumped out, a signature here, a date circled in red. It hit me slowly. This wasn't nostalgia. This was leverage, cataloged, organized. It started piecing together in my head, bits of gossip from years back, cases settled quietly, business deals that never made sense, people who disappeared from circles without explanation. All those little moves that didn't fit until you saw how many threads were tied together. That night I sat there debating. I'd been around long enough to know the unspoken rules. You keep your head down, don't ask questions, don't get involved. But this wasn't some harmless tape floating around. People were reacting before anything even hit the surface. And I wasn't the only one wondering how far it went. By the third day, the whispers had turned heavier. One of the assistants who worked closer to Diddy stopped showing up. No explanation, no official word, just gone. Another one of the legal guys, the one who handled contracts, had 3 back-to-back meetings off-site. Unusual for someone who never left the building without notice. It wasn't hard to figure out what was happening. People who saw even a sliver of the footage were making calls, checking with lawyers, preparing for something. Not for public fallout, but for the kind of consequences that stay behind closed doors. That's when I made the call. I didn't even know exactly what I was asking. I had a contact, someone I barely dealt with, but who had connections outside, the kind of fixer people use when they want things handled quietly. I figured if anyone could tell me how far this was spreading, they could. It wasn't a long conversation. I didn't give names, just asked if they'd heard anything about sensitive footage making the rounds. Their response was careful. Not public yet, they said, but it's moving. That was all they gave me, enough to confirm what I already knew. Whatever was in that folder, those names, those papers, wasn't staying buried. I should have stopped there, should have walked away, wiped my hands clean, pretended like none of it concerned me. But late that night, when I checked the server one more time, something new popped up. A screenshot. Not leaked wide, not plastered anywhere public, just tucked into a private folder, left unmarked, no explanation. I recognized it instantly. A freeze frame from the studio footage. Diddy sitting at his desk, folder spread out in front of him, and in his hand, a photo. The face in the photo wasn't blurred, wasn't hidden. It was clear as day. Someone big, someone I never would have expected to see there, let alone in a folder like that. The timestamp was even clearer. I stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. That wasn't something you could take back. And I had the sick feeling someone else had already started passing it along. Chapter 3. The Network Tightens. It didn't take long before you could feel the tension thick in the air, like something electric humming just beneath the surface. Even if no one came out and said it, you could see it in the way people started moving different. Conversations that used to happen in the open now got cut short when someone walked in the room. Meetings that used to have 15 faces now had 10. Familiar voices on the radios quieter, more clipped. No one wanted to be the first one to admit it, but everyone knew something was brewing, something that wasn't gonna stay quiet forever. I kept to my routine, same as always, eyes on the feeds, ears half-tuned to the hallway chatter, acting like none of it mattered to me, but it was impossible not to notice how fast the shift came. The same faces that used to bark orders, walk with that loose kind of confidence, now glanced over their shoulders more than once. Phones pulled out mid-conversation, text messages shot off, then pocketed without a word, and when they passed each other in the hall, there was this look in their eyes, like everyone was checking how much the other person knew without asking directly. It wasn't loud, that was the thing. Nothing public yet, no headlines, no statements, no media breathing down anyone's neck. It was all happening in the cracks, in the spaces where no cameras pointed, where people thought they were safe to scramble. Diddy, though, he wasn't scrambling. Not exactly, but you could see it settling on him, wearing him down minute by minute. He stopped smiling, stopped making those little side comments he used to when walking through the halls, the ones that let you know he was still in control. Now his steps were tighter, his voice lower, and most of the time, he kept to himself in that studio. Door closed, screens glowing behind him, hours passing with no one going in or out. Word started spreading about the lawyers first. You'd hear it from people who were just close enough to the edge to get pieces of the truth. One of the main guys, the one who'd been handling contracts for years, suddenly had a list of meetings out of nowhere. Off-site, always off-site, no explanation. Some of the staff joked maybe he was finally getting a vacation, but nobody really believed that. He wasn't the type. It wasn't hard to figure. He'd probably seen something on the footage, something enough to make him rethink where he stood if the walls came down. Then came the bodyguard. Quiet guy, but everyone knew him. Been around forever, the kind of presence you didn't notice until you realized he wasn't there anymore. One day he's at the door like always, nodding, doing his rounds. Next day, he's gone. Official story was personal reasons, the usual line, but people talk. Word was he'd been looking into other gigs weeks before, making sure he had a way out clean. Rumor had it he wanted nothing to do with whatever storm was about to hit. Diddy didn't say much about it, not out loud anyway, but the longer I watched the feeds, the more you could see it creeping into him. There'd be nights when the building emptied out, lights low, and he'd still be there in the studio, the same footage playing over and over on the monitors, no one else around. No meetings, just him staring at the screens like he was trying to piece something back together. Like maybe if he watched enough times, he could figure out exactly where things slipped out of his hands. I kept my distance, didn't ask questions, just did my job, checked the logs, kept my head low. But even I could feel how the walls were shifting. Every day, a little quieter, a little more cautious. The assistants who used to joke around while walking past my station stopped talking altogether. Eye contact faded. Everyone was waiting for something. Waiting for the first real crack to show. It came in the form of a phone call. Not to me, not directly, but word of it filtered through the channels that never quite shut down. Someone from the outside, a name I recognized but hadn't heard in a long time, a business associate from years back, someone who'd done deals with Diddy when things were still running smooth. Not part of the inner circle anymore, but not completely out of reach either. This person got their hands on a clip, not the whole feed, just a slice. Enough to know what was in the rest of it, enough to start making quiet demands. They didn't go public, that wasn't the game. They reached out through intermediaries' back channels, suggesting that maybe debts could be called in, favors once exchanged could now be paid. Nothing loud, nothing anyone outside would notice, but it set off alarms behind closed doors. The thing about leverage is, once it starts moving, it doesn't stop clean. Everyone who's touched it starts looking over their shoulder. Everyone starts wondering how much the next person knows and what they're willing to trade to keep their name out of the mess. Diddy's mood turned darker by the day. He stopped trusting the people closest to him. You could see it in how he kept checking over things himself: personnel reports, surveillance feeds, internal communications. He stopped delegating, stopped leaning on the usual people. I heard from someone down the hall that he'd gone days without sleeping more than a couple hours, replaying the same footage, trying to figure out who let it slip, who passed it along, who might turn next. And the thing is, nobody wanted to be the one holding the bag when it all finally blew. You could feel everyone slowly inching away from the center, trying to create distance without making it obvious. Meetings got rescheduled, longtime partners postponed calls. No big statements, no public betrayals, just empty space, where there used to be loyalty. I kept watching from my corner, wondering how long it would hold, wondering how much longer I could pretend like none of it touched me. Then one night, just before my shift was supposed to end, something new landed in the system. An unmarked message, no sender, no traceable line. It wasn't addressed to anyone specifically, but it was meant for Diddy. I shouldn't have opened it, probably wasn't my place, but curiosity's a dangerous thing. The message was short, only a few words. "We know what's on the rest of the tape. Let's talk." That was it. No signature, no demand, just a warning. And somehow that felt heavier than anything else. Because whoever sent it didn't need to say more. They knew they already had the upper hand. Chapter 4. The phone call that shouldn't exist. It always starts the same way. Quiet, like nothing's wrong. You think maybe the worst of it has passed, maybe people are just being cautious, maybe it'll all die down if nobody stirs the water too much. That's the trick. It creeps up, slow. You start believing in the silence until you realize it's not peace, it's the sound right before the drop. That's how it felt when the phone call surfaced. Not all at once, not blasted wide for everyone to see, not the kind of leak you could point fingers at and shut down. It started, like everything else had, behind closed doors, whispered about by people who shouldn't have had access in the first place. But the thing about recorded conversations is they don't need context to hurt. They just need to exist, and that call existed in full. I hadn't even seen the whole thing myself when word started circling. The message from the other night had already shifted something in the air, everyone walking around tighter, waiting for another shoe to drop. Then it became clear this wasn't just about screenshots or old photos. Someone had dug deeper. Someone had found the call. I finally got my hands on the segment after hours, when most people had cleared out, when no one was looking over my shoulder. It didn't start like anything special. Diddy in the studio, still slouched in that chair, folder pushed aside. He's quiet, glancing at his phone like he's debating whether to make the call at all. Then he dials. The number didn't trace to anyone. No saved contact, no name flashing up, just blank digits. His voice when he starts speaking. Calm, steady, but there's something sharp underneath. like someone walking carefully over thin ice, every word placed slow. He doesn't name names outright, he's smarter than that. But if you knew the right stories, if you'd been around long enough, you could hear exactly who he was talking about. He brings up old cases first, cases that had gone away too fast, settlements reached behind closed doors. Mentions a judge in passing, the kind of reference you don't make unless you're sure the other person knows what you mean. Talks about smoothing things over, favors done that can't be put on paper. Every sentence sounds casual, almost polite. But there's weight behind it, like he's reminding the person on the other end how deep their connections run, and what might happen if those debts ever got called in reverse. At one point, he even laughs. Not a real laugh, something hollow, says something about people forgetting who helped them climb up. How easy it is to lose track of old favors when you think no one's keeping score. I watched the call twice, maybe 3 times, before it hit me just how bad it was. Not because of anything said directly, but because of what it implied. Because it was all there, recorded clean, time-stamped, not just talk, not rumor. Proof that Diddy had been pulling strings in places no one wanted public. And now someone had their hands on it. The fallout didn't take long to start. It didn't explode. It sank in, like poison, working slow. Lawyers, ones who'd been around for years, ones who usually walked with that air of untouchable confidence, started moving different. Meetings went from in-person to remote. Requests for files, schedules, contracts suddenly took on a cautious tone. You could feel them recalculating in real time, trying to figure out how exposed they might be if the wrong part of that call landed in front of the wrong person. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. If that call got into the hands of the right legal team, it wouldn't just be Diddy's problem. It'd be a thread someone could pull until half the people tied to him unraveled with it. The worst part was, he knew it too. I saw him more restless than ever after that. No assistants following close, no bodyguards hovering. He walked faster, talked less, eyes darting from face to face like he was trying to clock who might have slipped. You could see him running the math in his head. Who had access? Who might have a copy? Who had reason to sell him out? And behind every conversation now, there was something unsaid. Even when he spoke to staff directly, even when the words sounded normal enough, you could feel it underneath. The suspicion, the weight pressing down. Every time someone paused too long, every time someone glanced at their phone mid-sentence, it was like a spark going off in his head. He started checking things himself. Security logs, storage reports, internal comms that should have been handled by 3 people below his level. I'd get requests for activity summaries late at night, times he shouldn't have even been awake. Cross-checking who had been in which room, who accessed which files, who downloaded what. But no matter how many times he looked, there wasn't anything concrete. Whoever passed that footage along knew exactly how to keep their tracks covered, knew better than to make it easy. And that's when things shifted again. I caught wind of it secondhand through one of the legal aides who usually stayed out of sight. Apparently, one of the names Diddy referenced on that call, the people tied to those old favors, had suddenly gone dark. No responses, no callbacks. Quietly hired outside counsel, someone disconnected from all the usual firms. That wasn't normal. That was someone preparing for a fallout before it happened. I don't think Diddy got confirmation right away. But he felt it. You could see it in how tightly wound he got, how quick he was to cut conversations short. I heard from someone 2 floors up that he confronted a few staff members directly. Not screaming, not accusing, but asking pointed questions, trying to read their reactions, watching every blink, every hesitation. But the thing about paranoia is, once it sets in, you stop trusting even the answers you get, especially when they sound too clean. The halls felt emptier after that. People not sticking around longer than necessary, meetings shortened, everyone keeping their heads down, eyes forward. I stayed at my station, same as always, but the difference was now I felt like I was the only one left still watching everything unfold, like the last person holding on to something no one wanted to acknowledge. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only going to get worse from here. Chapter 5. The Archives Ghosts. The thing about archives is, they don't start out as something dangerous, not at first. They start small, scraps, little pieces collected here and there, half out of habit, half because you've been burned one too many times and you're tired of leaving your back exposed. A photo from the right angle, a contract with the fine print highlighted, a message that wasn't supposed to be saved but somehow ends up filed away anyway. It doesn't seem like much when you're building it, but after years, decades, it becomes something else entirely, something heavier, and when you finally sit down to look at it all in one place, you realize it's not just a pile of insurance, it's a graveyard. That's where Diddy found himself, alone in the studio, the doors shut, blinds pulled tight, the air thick enough to choke on. He'd pulled out the physical folder more than once over the past few days, flipping through it like he could will the pages to erase themselves. But what was sitting in that drawer was only a fraction of what he'd kept. The real archive lived elsewhere, not in plain sight, digital, encrypted, layered deep enough that no one could stumble across it by accident. He'd built it methodically over the years, piece by piece, backing up what mattered, deleting what didn't. Some files mirrored in the physical world, contracts, letters, NDAs tucked away where they could be touched. Others, the more volatile things, kept where only he could reach them. But after the calls surfaced, after the names started pulling away, after the untraceable messages and tightened silences, it became clear to him that even the precautions weren't enough anymore. Someone knew too much. Someone was getting close. So he sat there, late into the night, laptop open, multiple drives connected, fingers moving slow as he unlocked the layers, passwords he hadn't typed in months, security checks nested within other checks, nothing careless, nothing accidental. And then there it all was. Folders dated back over 15 years, names scrawled on digital labels, not in full but in ways he'd know instantly, party footage, surveillance clips, emails forwarded to himself under dummy accounts, photos, some from official photographers, others snapped from shadows, corners, faces smiling for the camera, unaware of who else might be watching. He scrolled methodically, no emotion showing. A letter came up first, an agreement signed under the table, names redacted in public, but here, clear as day, attached to it, a wire transfer confirmation. Quiet money moved to keep mouths shut. Further down, contracts marked as voided, details suggesting otherwise. Disputes handled with hush payments, legal threats neutralized before they saw daylight. Then came the media files, grainy clips of rival figures, the kind of footage you don't post, the kind that gets used as leverage. Candid conversations caught on hidden recorders, faces blurred by low light, voices sharp even through muffled background noise. Each file told a story, some long forgotten, others still very much alive, and behind every one of them was a reason he kept it, a moment where trust broke, where loyalty shifted, where he decided never to be blindsided again. There was one folder he hovered over longer than the rest. No name on it, just a string of numbers. Inside, photos from an exclusive party years back. Familiar faces, ones that hadn't been in the public eye in a long time. Poses that looked innocent enough until you paid attention to the background. The people mingling where they shouldn't have been. Conversations caught mid-whisper. It wasn't just paranoia, it was survival. After enough betrayals, after enough times cleaning up messes other people left at his doorstep, you stop believing anyone's got your back, so you start keeping your own records. Just in case. He scrolled deeper, Old text chains archived, screenshots of agreements never made public, legal documents attached to shell companies, initials instead of names. The archive was meticulous, organized, a lifetime of self-preservation. And now, staring at it laid bare, he thought about deleting it. He thought about wiping every copy, burning the folder in his drawer, scrubbing the drives clean, starting fresh, walking away from the weight of it, cutting loose the anchors before they dragged him under. But he didn't. Instead, he closed the files, encrypted the drives again, slid the physical folder back into place, because no matter how dangerous it had become, letting go felt even riskier. The archive wasn't just protection anymore, it was part of him. Proof of what he'd survived, who he'd outlasted. Meanwhile, outside that room, the search for the leak kept tightening. His private investigators had been tracing movements for days. Staff schedules, access logs, server connections. Every person in the building accounted for, every download scrutinized. But every lead turned cold. No clear path, no obvious mole. Whoever passed the footage along knew how to vanish. I kept my distance, kept my head low like always. I wasn't stupid. I knew there were eyes on me too. Maybe not directly, but everyone was being watched now. Every log checked twice, every conversation monitored, and no one wanted to be the one standing closest when the next domino tipped. What Diddy didn't see, what none of them saw, was that it wasn't coming from where they expected. Late one night while I was finishing up my shift, I caught a blip in the logs. A small, routine transfer, internal. Nothing flagged. But the more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't as routine as it seemed. The request came from someone deep inside, someone with the kind of clearance no one questioned. Not an assistant, not a guard. A name that wouldn't raise suspicion if they copied files, wouldn't get second-guessed for accessing something most people couldn't reach. I stared at the log longer than I should have, pulse picking up. They weren't pulling a full archive, just bits. Pieces. Enough to stitch something together. Enough to sell if they needed to. I logged out, wiped my traces, didn't breathe a word. Because whoever was moving now, they were closer to Diddy than he could have imagined. Chapter 6. The Quiet Shakedown. It wasn't loud. That's the part people never understand. You think when something like this happens, when the walls finally give, you'll hear it, that it'll come crashing down with noise and mess, front-page headlines, sirens outside the gates. But the worst part about it is how quiet it really is, how it creeps in without sound, how you can't even tell which door it slipped through until it's standing right in front of you. That's how it felt the week everything shifted. It didn't explode, it sank in, slow, like water rising just below the surface, invisible until you realize your footing's gone. The mole made their move around then. Not publicly, not recklessly. Whoever they were, they knew better than to drag the archive into the light, where tabloids could chew it up and spit it out. That wasn't their aim. They went private, targeted, reached out to the kinds of people who don't speak in interviews, who don't care about headlines, the ones who move things behind the curtain. Competitors, legal enemies, old names Diddy had pushed to the side years ago, people who'd been waiting for leverage like this to fall into their laps. It wasn't hard to imagine how those conversations went. The archive wasn't just dirt. It was ammunition, quiet payoffs, contracts rewritten, surveillance footage of faces that had rather stay forgotten. Every file like a loaded gun passed across a table. No witnesses, no paper trail. And Diddy knew, maybe not who exactly, not yet, but he felt it in his bones. The shift. The way the people who used to circle him started pulling away in subtle steps. Conversations clipped short. Calls unanswered. Lawyers who once stood firm now double-checking old agreements, trying to see how much of their own signatures might be caught in the mess. He reacted the only way he knew how, He shut everything down. Communications, meetings, every channel that tied him to anyone outside his immediate reach. The mansion, already more fortress than home, turned into a bunker. Staff trimmed down to skeleton levels, phones locked, every message routed through 3 filters before it reached him. He spent hours in his private wing, blinds drawn tight, lights dimmed low, the hum of security monitors the only sound left in the background. Paranoia wasn't new to him. It had been stitched into his routine long before, but now it bled through everything, sharper, constant. You could feel it radiating off him like heat. He'd always been the one pulling strings, watching from the top, but now the cameras felt like they weren't his anymore, like someone else was watching through them. I saw him once that week, just briefly, when he passed by my station. No entourage, no one flanking him like usual. He walked past, quick, head down, like he couldn't afford the weight of eye contact anymore. But there was something in his posture, tight, defensive, that made me pause. You could tell when a man's trapped in his own house. That's when one of his old confidants came back around. Someone who hadn't been seen much since things first started slipping, suddenly showing up under the guise of checking in. From the outside, it looked casual, just 2 people talking behind closed doors. Nothing unusual. But anyone watching close enough could read the double meanings stitched into every word. The conversation stretched longer than most, voices low, careful, each one testing the other, prodding gently at old alliances, trying to figure out how much the other person knew without saying too much, offers disguised as concern, warnings wrapped in pleasantries. Neither of them trusting the other enough to let their guard down, but both too cautious to break the silence outright. I didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. Both of them weighing options, trying to figure out if cutting ties now might save them later, or if clinging to whatever leverage they had left was still worth something. Outside those walls, more moves were happening. Lawyers for the figures caught up in the footage began reaching out, not in public filings, not in dramatic courtroom gestures, but quiet negotiations behind heavy doors. People making sure their names stayed clean if the archive ever saw wider daylight. Deals being rearranged, settlements rechecked, old favors dredged back up like anchors pulled from the ocean floor. Everyone knew the footage hadn't leaked yet, not fully, but the threat hung there, thick and heavy, enough to make people scramble before the blow actually landed. Diddy felt it closing in. You could see it in how restless he became, how little sleep he got, nights spent watching the same feeds over and over, eyes flicking from camera angle to camera angle like he expected something to slip through, like he wasn't sure anymore which lens belonged to him and which ones had already been turned. And after a while, even when nothing moved, he started seeing things anyway. Shadows passing just out of frame, faces half glimpsed through reflections that disappeared when he looked twice, old associates lingering in doorways, mouths moving without sound, like ghosts replaying something they'd already said. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was something deeper. The archive wasn't just files. It was history staring back at him, all the people he'd kept records on, all the names, the debts, the faces that now circled like vultures. Every time he replayed a clip or scrolled through a folder, it was like dredging up pieces of himself he couldn't scrub clean. Then came the ultimatum. It didn't come through official channels, no lawyer, no intermediary. Just a single message, no sender attached, plain text. You know what we have, pay or watch it burn. The sum wasn't small. Wasn't something you could write off, bury in another shell company. It was deliberate, enough to hurt, enough to let him know they weren't bluffing. And the part that mattered most wasn't the money. It was the fact that whoever sent it knew exactly what was in those files. Knew he couldn't risk calling their bluff. Because once the archive left his hands, there wouldn't be any walking back. Chapter 7. The House of Glass. It's strange how quiet collapse can be. You expect noise, walls crumbling, people shouting, phones ringing nonstop. But when it really happens, when something that took decades to build starts falling apart, it happens in silence. The kind of silence that settles so thick you can almost hear the space it leaves behind. That's what it felt like when things started unraveling. No headlines, no breaking news alerts, just empty rooms. It began with the deals. Contracts that had been rock solid for years suddenly disappeared off the table. Business partners who once begged for meetings stopped returning calls. No official statements, no severance announcements, just unread emails, cold acknowledgments, offers quietly withdrawn without explanation. Deals dissolved like they'd never existed at all. I watched it happen from my corner, the same as always. The assistant on the 5th floor stopped showing up to work. Word got around that a sponsorship deal fell through. Nobody wanted to put their name next to Diddy's anymore, not with whispers of what was buried in the archive floating through the halls. No press releases, no drama. Just space left where connections used to be. One by one, longtime staff started vanishing. Not fired, not pushed out. They left on their own. No goodbye parties, no loose ends. Some sent a polite message, others didn't bother. They weren't running to something better. They were pulling back, making sure they wouldn't be in the blast radius when everything finally hit. And Diddy noticed. You could feel it in the way he moved, slower, more deliberate. No entourage flanking him, no assistants buzzing around. Every time he passed through the hallways, his eyes tracked every person left, like he was trying to memorize who was still standing. He didn't trust anyone by then, not even himself. The security system he'd built, layered, tight, feeds covering every inch, felt like a joke now. Cameras pointed everywhere, monitors stacked one on top of another. But the footage never showed him what he really wanted to see. Every room looked the same, empty. Every person walking past felt like a question mark. The archive loomed heavier than ever. He kept it close, locked down tighter than before, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. The footage had moved. People knew, and the names wrapped up in it, the ones who'd once stood by him, weren't standing anymore. Legal threats came in waves, quiet, not public, but sharp enough to cut. Former allies flipping, scrambling to protect themselves, statements signed behind closed doors, testimonies sworn without ever reaching headlines. Every new file sent to Diddy's legal team chipped away at the foundation, people who used to owe him now trading favors with the other side. I overheard the lawyers talking more than once. No shouting matches, just low voices, tense, filled with numbers and names, calculations. Every new threat came with another choice to make, and none of the options looked good. And still, no one outside noticed. No news story ran with any of it. No viral clips. The empire cracked slowly, soundlessly, where no one could point and watch it fall. Diddy retreated deeper into the mansion. Whole wings went unused, staff trimmed to nothing. He barely left his room, let alone the property. He trusted no one, not anymore, and he watched every screen like the answer might suddenly flash across one of them. There was one last offer. One final deal slid across the table in hushed voices by someone who thought maybe there was still a way out. Hand over everything. The archive, the copies, the backups, traded in, limited immunity, walk away. I don't know who made the offer. Could have been legal, could have been one of the former partners, could have been someone from deeper behind the scenes. But it didn't matter. It was the kind of deal you don't make unless you're already at the edge. And he refused. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. Or maybe because once you've built a house of glass, the only thing worse than watching it shatter is handing over the hammer yourself. He didn't say no publicly. No declarations, just silence. No papers signed, no deals taken. The house kept emptying. The walls felt thinner. You could hear every step echo longer than before. And then came the last blow. It didn't come with an announcement. I noticed it first in the logs. A name missing where it shouldn't have been. Someone who had always been there, right up next to him, closer than anyone else left. Their access revoked. No message, no warning. I checked again. Their office was empty. Gone, no trace. At first, it didn't seem like more than one more resignation. One more person slipping away before the whole thing caved in. But later that night, when I checked the system again, I saw it. A single transfer. Small, discreet, barely flagged. One file pulled, the master copy, and they were gone. Chapter 8. No audience left. There wasn't any big reveal. No expose dropped, no scandal tearing through the headlines. That was the part no one outside ever saw, the part people don't talk about when they imagine someone falling. It didn't happen in public, it didn't need to. Everything unraveled behind locked doors, where it hurt the most, where it couldn't be spun or controlled or denied. The archive never leaked, not to the public at least. The footage, the documents, the old photographs, the files with signatures and timestamps, they stayed buried where only the right eyes could see them, passed hand to hand, room to room. Names quietly erased from contracts, partnerships dissolved without explanation. Phones stopped ringing, meetings canceled without rescheduling, no reason given, just absence. No headlines, no scandals, just doors closing one by one. I saw it from where I stood, long after most of the others had left. The shift wasn't loud. It was in the silence, the empty seats at tables, the darkened offices. Deals that used to feel inevitable suddenly vanished, like they'd never existed at all. Names removed from guest lists, invitations stopped being sent. Diddy's name stopped opening doors, stopped meaning anything. I stayed because I'd already been invisible for so long, it didn't make sense to leave. There wasn't anyone left to notice anyway. He didn't trust the people who remained, not that there were many. Most of them had walked out weeks before. The last few stayed because they had nowhere else to go, or maybe because they wanted to watch what happened when someone like him hit bottom. He stopped talking to us, barely left his private wing, the rest of the house hollow and cold. Security feeds still running, screens lit, cameras humming, but no one watched them now, not really. He had stopped trusting even the systems he'd built. Every flicker on the monitor could be another betrayal waiting, every shadow another knife in his back. Legal papers still came in, not lawsuits anymore, those had stopped before they could reach court. Settlements closed quietly, out of sight, names removed from filings before anyone could catch them. It wasn't about the law now, it was about erasure. One by one, the figures who'd once circled him flipped. They cut deals, protected themselves, rearranged their allegiances. Careers ended quietly. No social media storms, no interviews, no breaking stories. Just gaps left where people used to be. Diddy tried to hold it together at first. Kept checking his feeds, kept running through files like maybe if he stayed a step ahead, he could stop the bleeding. But the damage wasn't something you could rewind. It had already spread too far, moved in ways he couldn't predict. The archive was out there now, fragmented, passed in back rooms, used like currency in negotiations he'd never be part of. And the thing is, when the people you built your empire with stop returning your calls, it doesn't matter how much you think you know, there's nothing left to leverage, no audience left to listen. He stopped reaching out eventually. The phones in the mansion barely rang. Meetings disappeared from the calendar. Business opportunities thinned out to nothing. It wasn't public failure, it was worse. It was being forgotten. I'd pass by his room sometimes, see the glow from the monitors, feeds looping the same footage he'd watched 100 times before, faces flickering across the screens, rooms empty, doors never opening. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just stared. I started turning off more of the systems each night. No point keeping them running, no one left to watch. The house felt larger with every day. Every step echoed. You could feel the weight of it. What used to be a kingdom, now hollow. No one waiting, no one calling. And in the end, it came down to one final moment. He stood in front of the last monitor, the room dark around him. No cameras left recording, no security feeds he trusted, just a single blank screen. No audience, no eyes watching, nothing left. He stood there a long time, long enough to realize that silence was the only thing left that couldn't be taken away.